You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 7 of the Ecocide Report. My name is Chidi Obihara. We're recording from the RSA again this time. I'll be speaking to Jojo Mather, the Executive Director of Stop Ecocide International, to find out more about all of the activities that have gone on in the recent past and also what we're planning for the near future. Right, Jojo, where should we start?
I think my inclination would be to start with the how much has advanced at the diplomatic level, how much is advancing in national parliaments, because just the last few months have seen half a dozen countries where ecocide laws have been either submitted into parliaments or proposed or announced, and that's remarkable. So from Brazil to the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, Mexico, to just last week an announcement in Scotland of a consultation that will lead to the proposal of a bill. There's a kind of a wave happening here. Effectively, when we began this advocacy work a number of years ago, we were aiming, and we still are aiming, for ecocide to become an international crime at the International Criminal Court as part of the Rome Statute. And at the time, I think we thought that if we tried to push things, one jurisdiction at a time, that this could take a very long time and we could end up with a real jigsaw of different definitions and, it could be distracting. Now, actually, in reality, what's happened, which is very exciting, is that in fact those different levels have proved to be mutually reinforcing. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot of all of this sort of, when you sort of look back, we can see a sort of point of origin, in a sense, in the launch of the proposed international definition. It created a huge wave of press interest, but also a lot of political interest that has meant that the regional and national level developments that have been happening have all relate closely to that definition. So the bills that are being proposed into parliaments, the text that the European Parliament has proposed into discussions with the Commission and the Council at the European level, all relate closely or coherent with that international definition. So what we're seeing is that there's a kind of convergence here, there's a harmonizing effect that's going on, and actually each of those levels seems to be reinforcing the other. So obviously the direction of travel is now really establishing itself quite clearly, and that's super, super encouraging.
Excellent. The Volker Türk endorsement, what was that about in September?
Volker Türk, as many of you may know, is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has recently publicly endorsed this initiative to criminalise ecocide in no uncertain terms. And this, I think, speaks to another kind of thread that is emerging in this work. And that is the kind of bringing together of the human rights discourse with the environmental harms discourse. And for example, we saw this earlier in the year in Africa, where the African Commission on Human and People's Rights was very interested in the ecocide discussion. We often see actually a difference between, say, the European context and the context in Africa or Latin America, where there's a much more intuitive connecting that happens between environmental damage and human rights violations. And so there's a kind of coming together of those two narratives. And I think, we also see that in conjunction with environmental damage in wartime as well, that, we can see that there are correlations there with also harms to people. So it sort of feels like perhaps a natural evolution that area of work, and of course, Volker Türk is at the top of that particular arena, if you like, should come into play at this point.
Well, as we're looking at regions, could you also talk a bit more detail about the Arctic Circle Assembly?
Yes, so the last few months have seen us in a number of different fora in different parts of the world. I attended the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik last month, which is the biggest sort of Arctic-focused conference that happens every year. So that was an interesting forum to be in, and it was we had an official side event there, and a lot of we also noticed there was a lot of indigenous input into that conference as well, which is something that is another thread that's emerging within this initiative. But we've also been present in Turkey at the Horasis conference, but also at the UN level at the regional climate weeks, for example, in Panama. Our Latin America director was involved in that, and we held events and webinars as well there. And that was interesting because it was in the midst of actual unrest in Panama City, so some of the in-person events got cancelled, but they still continued online. And yeah, a number of other sort of international developments have meant that we've been kind of popping up all over the world. I was personally in Rome for the launch of the Italian bill. I was just listing the different countries, and Italy was one of those countries where the Green Left Alliance put a proposal through to their parliament. So I was there at the Camera dei Deputati for the launch of that. And these proposals are all sort of at different stages, but it's very exciting to see that even in countries that might not immediately look like an easy ride, that the bills are kind of progressing. So we've seen that in Brazil, for example, the first reading at the Environmental Committee, the bill has passed through that level. So these developments are all very encouraging.
Excellent. You mentioned Brazil, and you talk about indigenous people, and it's, for me, it automatically calls up images of what the Nature of Finance report might be about, because we know that interaction between nature and humans and the way it's valued is crucially important for us. Could you talk a bit more detail about that?
Yes, this is really interesting. As this conversation grows, we're finding that the business and finance world are getting ever more interested. There are more and more points of contact with those areas. And in fact, this summer, the Taskforce on Nature Finance,
Taskforce on Nature-related financial disclosure.
Oh, for goodness sake. Forgive me for not remembering the exact terms, that's right. But brought out a report on how making nature markets work. And what's really interesting is to see the kind of linkages that are being made there between ecocide law, and in other words, protective parameters around nature, but also issues like money laundering, and how those potentially interact in terms of identifying when finance might be heading in a direction that could be damaging to ecosystems. And it's really interesting to see those things being openly acknowledged in this arena of finance, which historically has had a little bit of a level of immunity and sort of untouchability when it comes to damage to the environment. And I think that bringing criminal law into that sphere exactly is actually going to be very helpful. We've also seen that the exponential roadmap, which is a project coming out of, I think, UN Climate Champions and various businesses as well, also kind of touches on some of these areas. So, and at the same time, we've got a business open letter that you can find on our website where more and more businesses are kind of endorsing what we're doing. I think what's interesting is we're seeing a sort of three different kinds of response, loosely speaking, from the corporate world. So there's complete silence, which is coming from the big polluters. They're not going to want to be spoil their decades of greenwashing by objecting to this in public. Then and at the other end, we're seeing the sustainability leaders really starting to speak up for this, because of course at the moment they're disadvantaged. They're trying to do the right thing, and of course they're being undercut and by those who really don't care. So for them, this is an obvious kind of playing field leveler, and there's something very obvious to support here. Then there's probably the larger section in the middle of many businesses who simply either don't know much about this yet, or are kind of have a little bit of a tendency to look for a very fine red line for their particular sector, so they kind of know what boxes they should tick. And then probably sit there and resent having to tick them. But what we are kind of, in a sense, encouraging in this area is the understanding that this law, and particularly this very concise and understandable definition, is actually a kind of a gift for those people, because what it actually enables them to do is to join some fundamental dots between, their working life and their job ticking boxes and filling out reports and making recommendations and so on, and what's actually happening out there in the world. So if you like, what the aim is to have those risk managers, those in-house counsel, talking to their operational people. What is it that's happening on the ground? And if we look at it through this lens, what do we need to adjust? And so, there's this sort of, range, I suppose, of responses. But what's been, very important, I think, is that the business and finance world are now actively starting to engage with this, and that's been, we can see that in these reports coming out.
That's excellent, and it's, without pulling too strong a pivot, it's interesting at a time like this, when international conflict is on the agenda, we seem to be misplacing our wars sometimes, trying to figure out what the best way is to characterize conflict, the impact it has on nature, the longer term impacts of war are challenging. I know that in the past you and I have mentioned issues around environmental justice in Ukraine. Have there been developments on that front?
There certainly have. So Ukraine, we spoke in one of our earlier episodes about a justice conference that was held in Ukraine in March. A second iteration of the United for Justice conference was held in Kiev in October, and it was actually specifically focusing on environmental damage. It was actually called, I think, United for Justice, United for Nature. Mm-hmm. And some of our legal associates were there presenting on ecocide, and there's been a lot of interest in terms of Ukraine being probably the first country to use its own existing provision on ecocide to start to bring prosecutions. So that's something that's sort of in process over there. But also, and we have touched on this before in other episodes, but there's a really strong interest from Ukraine in sort of backing and supporting the criminalisation of ecocide as a standalone crime and as an international crime. So at the national level, it's not easy to approach leadership crimes, which obviously, as you can imagine, Ukraine's very interested in. That involves the international level. And there is some provision at international level, which they're looking into using. But I think it's interesting that they are very much supporting the drive towards criminalising ecocide per se. And I think what this is kind of acknowledging is that historically, during wartime, there's been an obvious focus on immediate, human harm, infrastructure damage, damage to civilian property, and so on. And I think what is sometimes overlooked because it's silent. I mean, one thing Ukraine is saying a lot, nature is the silent victim of this conflict, is that the kind of damage that affects the environment, it often goes beyond the conflict zone geographically, but it also often goes beyond, it outlasts the damage, exactly. So there's something around focusing on that most serious level of harm as worthy of examination and prosecution and so on in its own right is very important, and and it will be something that that will emerge in any area of conflict, and I have no doubt that it will also be a major issue in the Middle East and other parts of the world where conflicts are ongoing.
100%. Unfortunately, with the state of global politics being the way it is, we will probably see more and more of these as challenges expand. But let's stay in Northern Europe for now. I know you were involved with the Nordic Council.
So the Nordic Council is a kind of coalition, if you like, of Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, as well as the Åland Islands, the Faroe Islands, Greenland. And some of our political associates, parliamentarians from Sweden, from the Åland Islands, have been pushing for that council to discuss and come to recommendations around ecocide. That's been, a fairly lengthy journey, because that's obviously quite a few countries involved in those discussions. But recently, they did actually come to unanimous support for seriously examining the criminalisation of the most severe harms to the environment. So that that's a real sort of milestone that that will have ramifications in all of those countries. So that's also very encouraging. And those parliamentarians also are members of a kind of parliamentarians coalition on ecocide called the Ecocide Alliance, which interested parliamentarians from anywhere around the world can join and exchange information and support around progressing ecocide bills in different countries, and also supporting the international initiative.
Interesting. Within the context of sort of developing some of the stuff that we sort of did together at Anthropy in Cornwall, you had this incredible set piece, you and Sir Tim Smith, I think it was, where you talked in a lot of detail about the direction which Stop Ecocide International was going. Did you want to share some of that with our audience?
Well, I mean, obviously they'll be familiar with some of that if they've been watching our episodes. The nice thing about this particular conference, which is held at the Eden Project in Cornwall, is that on this occasion we actually had a kind of a conversation that allowed for quite in-depth discussion around various issues relating to ecocide, and that's quite unusual, because one of the things that we are spend most of our time doing is bringing the conversation into as many different arenas as possible, and often that involves a kind of 5-minute intervention here or a 2-minute intervention there, and but actually reaching different audiences all the time. So for me personally, it's always a treat when I get to have a longer conversation, and some of those more in-depth questions can get looked at, and also one can invite questions from the audience and have more of an interactive dialogue. That's always exciting when that happens. I mean, I remember one of the things that Tim was pushing back. He said, what about, this word ecocide? Surely this word ecocide is a difficult one for people to get their heads around, which I completely disagreed with, actually, in the sense that I believe that, what we've actually witnessed is that the word has an internal momentum that has actually really helped this initiative to kind of snowball. There's this sense of, it comes from the Greek and Latin, actually. Oikos meaning house, kedere meaning to kill, so ecocide is to kill one's home. And that just feels like such an apt way to describe what's happening to the planet right now, that there is some way that kind of encapsulates something. Plus, of course, in comparison to, say, one of these long-winded titles for international treaties. I mean, the one I always think of, which I can actually never remember the exact wording of, is something like the legally binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights violations and environmental harms, or something like this. And of course, if you stop someone in the street and start talking about that, they're going to be asleep by the third word. Whereas ecocide is, really kind of encapsulates something that we can all feel and see to be happening. And I think that was one of the little standout moments for me in that.
It was. And I think the other thing I noticed about it was that you were very broad and international. As you said, you responded primarily to questions from the audience. I was a bit surprised, though, there are very few questions about domestic issues, like, for example, what's happening with ecocide in Scotland. That didn't come up.
I think the way that this has grown has kind of come from the international level to sort of local levels. And it's also true that the UK has not, hitherto been a front runner in this. There's no way we can deny that. That may change. We'll have to see what happens in the coming months. But Scotland is definitely taking the lead here, in the sense that Monica Lennon, who's a member of the Scottish Parliament, has launched a consultation around the potential putting forward of a private member's bill there, so creating an ecocide law in Scotland. And I think, Scotland's been quite a climate leader internationally. They're one of the first to sort of put funds into a loss and damage fund, those kinds of things. So it sort of feels kind of in keeping with, their record. They're wanting to be seen, I think, as leaders in this space. But yeah, and that, as I say, that may change in terms of the conversation at Westminster as well. So watch this space.
Excellent, excellent. There's also an intergenerational element, I think, of the work that Stop Ecocide International does that we don't focus on very much. So I'm thinking more of the Rights of the Child report.
Yes, indeed. So there's a recent report that's emerged on ecocide law and the rights of the child and how those two things interact. And we had a launch event just last week, actually. And we will have a kind of executive summary version of that report, which will be broadly sort of available very soon. And I think this speaks to an aspect of the movement towards calling for ecocide legislation, which is very strongly present in the youth community internationally. And we have an associate network, Youth for Ecocide Law, that is growing at a rate of knots. And the couple of times that I've been privileged to join one of their meetings, there are always faces from all over the world. It is absolutely diverse, and it's absolutely joyously encouraging to see that conversation happening at that level. And I mean, for example, in some areas, like for example in Africa, that many of our sort of associate groups and branches in different parts of Africa are actually led by young people. And it's so important. I mean, and it's also kind of in a sense intuitively obvious that young people would be supporting this, because this is about protecting their future. It's about protecting,
100%. If they're going to be on the front line, they might as well be up front and centre.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
The European Crime Directive. What progress have you made there?
So there's been interesting developments in Europe, actually. As we have previously talked about, the European Parliament put forward quite a strong text on a kind of a general offence of ecocide, or ecocide level crimes, should we say, to be potentially included in the revised Environmental Crimes Directive that's been under revision over the last year and a half. And we were expecting some kind of text to emerge back in July as a result of conversations with the European Commission and the Council, which is obviously the member states. So they have these discussions that are known as trilogues, but they didn't come to agreement at that point, and that was then pushed back to October. And interestingly, still didn't come to agreement in October, and so it was pushed back again to this month, to November, and actually we're anticipating this very week those discussions to come to some kind of conclusion and for a text to emerge. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's actually the Parliament has been quite adamant that they want, this is not something they want to concede on. So in terms of those negotiations, this is also what's kind of kept that discussion going and not resolving. But what that also means, we haven't yet seen what text will emerge. And we imagine, due to how long it's taken to reach this point, that it probably won't be the same text that was originally proposed by the Parliament. But what we do know is that it will be a step in the right direction, because this, this would not have, this drawn-out negotiation would not have occurred otherwise. So we're definitely looking at something that will bring those more severe levels of environmental crime into the picture in some way. So we're looking forward this week to what emerges from those hopefully final discussions. And I think, again, we're seeing this really strong regional piece potentially, therefore coming into play, or at least, coming into the right sort of ballpark, and that's very important because again it speaks upwards to the international level at the ICC and encouraging that, but it also encourages more national jurisdictions to move forward with their own versions. And we also know that the Council of Europe is involved in developing a convention on protection of the environment through criminal law, and of course 27 of its members are also of the European Union, and then there are another a couple of dozen members, because I think there's 46 members of the Council of Europe. So there will be, so these kind of regional documents are progressing kind of in tandem, if you like.
That's excellent. That's excellent. I know it's only November, but we could potentially talk about Christmas.
Christmas feels like a long way away still, because there's so much still to happen between now and then for this work. Most obviously, we will have a presence at COP28. I'm delighted that you're going to be accompanying us there. And we will have a team there for the full 2 weeks. And we have an official side event alongside a number of other organisations, the Global Greens, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Global Choices, focus on the Arctic, and that's going to be an event focusing on legal avenues, various different ones, and Vanuatu is co-sponsoring that, and we will also have a representative from the government of Brazil as well. So that will be a really interesting event that's part of the official programme, but we're also taking part in events in various different pavilions and contexts, and we will have a kind of floating advocacy team there. So we'll definitely be making sure that this conversation is part of that, you know, that bigger COP28 picture. We're also aware that there are a number of people kind of boycotting COP this year, you know, not keen on supporting the fact that it's happening in, you know, in the Middle East, you know, with clear connections with the oil industry. You know, these are not necessarily things that ultimately mean that the discussions will not be productive, but we can also see why people have found that difficult or objectionable. On the other hand, we strongly believe that this conversation about ecocide law absolutely has to be in that mix and has to be visible there. And you know, it's really important that we don't sort of abdicate that responsibility to, you know, to bring this absolutely key kind of framing legislative piece into those discussions.
I hear you loud and clear. I think that the idea that this stocktake COP, which is I suppose what it's about, shouldn't attract attention because of the perceived and actual conflicts of interest that appear to have moved front and center for it. It is widespread. Lots of people are very conflicted about it. But I also think that Stop Ecocide International has a special place in a conference or a process where there is a stocktake, where there is a setting of base levels of either nature or climate. I think that there's definitely a function that can be served there. But I'm going to pivot back to this issue of Christmas because I think that there's a fundraiser, there's a Big Give fundraiser you have for Christmas, isn't there?
You're absolutely right. I'm glad you brought this up. Yeah, we are going to be partnering with the Big Give, which is an arrangement whereby we effectively put out a kind of fundraising ask during a particular time, which I believe is going to be 28th of November to the 5th of December, and a way that you can give a Christmas present without encouraging the manufacture of more and more unnecessary stuff in the world is by supporting that fundraise and doing it in the name of somebody that you want to give a gift to. And then all of those funds will be matched by a generous funder who's putting that on the table as a possibility. So that's going to be a really effective fundraising opportunity for us, as well as a beautiful opportunity for a Christmas gift that is really doing something very concrete in the world to protect that world. So yeah, so that's a really important one. And while we're on the topic of these upcoming weeks, of course, there are actually two major events that we are going to be present at. So one obviously is COP28, as we were just mentioning, but there is also the International Criminal Court's annual assembly, which normally happens in The Hague, but every few years it takes place at the UN in New York. And that's what's happening this year. All countries have a mission to the UN. So there is state representation from all countries in the New York context. And we're seeing an increasing number of meetings and conversations going on in that arena too. So yeah, all very exciting.
Excellent, excellent. It's quite the tour de force. I think that the way that Stop Ecocide International has evolved and the number of geographies and international bodies that you've worked with in the past 3 months is just outstanding. Are there any broad ambitions you have for the close of the year? Only 6 weeks.
God,
that
don't
you haven't
say
already met. Or you're going to shunt them to next year?
Gosh, well, for us, this time of year is always absolutely packed and crucial. So, you know, it's when the climate COPs happen, it's sometimes when the biodiversity COPs happen too, and it's also when the Assembly of States Parties for the International Criminal Court happens. And that is, of course, our key forum, you know, given that we're aiming for an international crime. And I suppose what we are hoping for this year is to have the engagement in, probably at an informal level at this stage, but the engagement of a number of states in this conversation, sort of heading towards perhaps a more formalised context for negotiating something at the International Criminal Court. It's early stages, but what we do know is that over the last few years, we've regularly broken attendance records for ICC events, and you know, this is very much a kind of a hot topic, you could say. And I think, I mean, there are a couple of things that, in a sense, we aim to highlight, which are these kind of crossover points between different areas of suffering, actually. So when we're looking at the two most severe threats to humanity, if you like, you've got climate change and you've got conflict. And where do those two meet? At this particular missing law, which actually is relevant to both. And, you know, so it's looking at these kind of convergences. And also, I think, making some connections where, I mean, let's say, you know, the climate space, for example, is so dominated by the carbon emissions question. It's so dominated by, you know, reduction of emissions and, you know, tracking carbon. And it's not that that's not important, of course, but, you know, when we look at habitat destruction and desertification, for example, you know, that is an absolutely fundamental cause of climate change. It's also a point of intervention that's much easier to address in terms of restoration and actually doing the right thing. And of course, ecocide law, in terms of that protective function, particularly of ecosystems, really plays into this. I mean, you know, we know that it's possible to, you know, renature, if you like, you know, really quite denuded landscapes in a relatively short time. And by doing so, bring the temperature down in those places by 15 to 20 degrees. You know, when you know those kinds of things, it makes you realise how important it is that we protect where we have those natural landscapes and where we have ecosystems that are absolutely sustaining, you know, our biodiversity and climate.
That's excellent. I couldn't say it better myself. The ability to focus on solutions that Stop Ecocide International as an organization is creating has so many second order effects. Understanding that it's much more important to draw a line under potential bad practice, but also use that standard as a way to encourage good practice in other places. I think that if people are looking for something to support, to advocate for, that has got to be it for Christmas, right?
Absolutely, we certainly hope so. You know, this is something that is supported by so many in so many places and in so many different ways, whether it's from, you know, from academia to, you know, on the street activism to, you know, advocacy work in so many levels. So I just want to express this huge gratitude, actually. It's just, you know, things are moving so fast now, and this feels, as it should be, unstoppable. So yeah, I just want to recognise that and you know, stay abreast of what we're doing by making sure you're on our mailing list.
Excellent, excellent. And on that high note, until next time, thank you for watching the Ecocide Report.
You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.